Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So the project lead of this project is Purbita. And so Purbita, I will let you do the introduction of your students as you know them much better than I do at this point.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pretty eventful and awesome summer in terms of the birds and everything we've learned about them. Hadia, Rosalie, Gian, Kashish, and I, we were all relatively new to Caven Point. I'd been out there, and again, for those who aren't familiar with Caven Point, it's a tiny, tiny section of Liberty State Park right next to the National Golf Course that's mostly open to the public. There's a little hidden away boardwalk that you can hike out to, and it feels very secluded. It's marshy, it's full of wildlife noises, and more people in Jersey City should have access to it and should be informed about it so that they can enjoy it just like the 5 of us did this summer. But it was fantastic to see the 4 interns really go from noticing pigeons in their city to noticing 30 to 40 different species that we experienced out on Caven Point. And again, even though it's a very tiny habitat, there is a lot going on, much because you have this really special beach habitat out on Caven Point, and the tides are just phenomenal. They change very quickly, and the wildlife changes with it. So that pulled up a lot of scientific questions for the 4 interns, and they all sort of branched off and came up with their own projects and surveys to get to know how the birds are managing with the wildlife and the human pressures that are surrounding them in this part of the park. So I will hand it off to the 4 of them who put together this presentation of all their work. And yeah, please direct any questions to them as well.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna be the one sharing my screen. So I'm gonna do that.
Thank you, Rosalie.
Okay, hold on, I have to, okay. Sorry. Okay. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Let me start there. Okay, so I'm gonna just introduce our projects for now. So we were the birding group in the Greener JC internship. We all had our own individual projects, so we each have like our own slide presenting those projects. So the first, I believe, is Hadia. So, Hadia.
Hi, my name is Hadia, and I will be presenting the survey on birds at Caven Point in relationship to the tide. As Purbita was saying, when I first was about to visit Caven Point, I honestly thought that I would only see pigeons and like seagulls and Canadian geese, but I was completely wrong. And the first day I was shocked because in a short amount of time, the tides changed so much and we saw so many different species. So my hypothesis for this survey was that there will be more long-legged birds when the tide is high when compared to when the tide is low. So to collect the data for my survey, I used the Write in the Rain notebook, a pencil.
Sorry. Okay. Is it back?
We still see it, Rosalie.
Okay.
Okay, sorry.
So I used the Write in the Rain notebook, a pencil, the Tide King app, the Peterson Field Guide to identify all the birds that we were seeing, and the Merlin app. And the methods I used was that each week from 9 to 12, I would record what birds I would see from the boat dock versus what would I see at the marsh at Caven Point. and the short legs and long leg birds were distinguished after further research done on the physical appearance of the species. So if you guys can take a look at the data, we can see that week 4 is depicted by the color green, and that's when the tide was the highest. And that's when our group saw the highest number of species, which was 20, versus when it was week 5 when the tide was the lowest and we saw more short-legged birds versus long-legged birds. And the short-legged and long-legged birds were depicted by the proportion of the bird's body versus its legs. So if the bird had a larger body compared to its legs, then I marked it as long-legged birds, and some short-legged birds that we saw were the semi-palmated plover and a snowy, and the long-legged birds that we saw were gray egret, blue heron, and green heron. And after I got all my results over the 6 weeks, my hypothesis was correct, and there were more long-legged birds when the tide was high compared to when the tide was low. And when analyzing the behaviors of the birds depending on the tides, I found out that the birds were more active when the tide was high. And by active, I mean they were feeding more, they were flying around, and they were just moving more compared to when the tide was low and you could see a lot of the mud. So yeah, and if you guys look at the first picture to the left, that's a picture of the great egret. The picture on the second picture to the right on top is the kingfisher, and the bottom picture is an oyster catcher, which is, it's not rare to see, but like during this time we only saw it twice. So the bigger one is obviously the adult, and the smaller one is the baby. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to my project, which was I did a study on the Caven Point birds and their territorial habits and interactions. So similar to the people in my group, I really had never been to Caven Point in my life. I honestly thought we weren't allowed to go there because like the golf course seemed very private and exclusive. Going there, seeing the birds was like a big surprise, so it was really cool. One of the birds I noticed first, however, was the snowy egret because it's like this white spot in like this green land. So like I took like a special interest in that. And I was also curious of like since there were so many birds in this area, I was curious about their territories and how that actually affected the way they were feeding and basically their overall behavior. So the main question I was following was how these territories of the seabirds affect their behaviors and their actions. My prediction was that I believe these birds, while sharing the same habitat and area, the saltwater estuary, that they would attempt to find times in which to avoid each other, whether it be like hiding away in like the sand dunes or something like that, or just overall just not being there. So my method, I conducted my study in Caven Point every Tuesday between 11 and 12 p.m. on the east end of the beach. If you can see my screen, I usually conducted it where that patch of sand is right there. My study group was conducted on the birds that were within the given area of the sand. I did take a particular interest and focus on the snowy egret and their various plovers. The two plovers I took main focus on were the semi-pulmonated plover, which is there in the middle, and the black-bellied plover. And of course the snowy egret, probably one of my favorite birds in the whole Caven Point. So the data I took was a representation of their time spent within the hour that I was observing them. So if you can see on the pie chart on the side that's labeled data, the first one is the snowy egret. It spent most of its time actually feeding and hunting, while it spent a little less time cleaning itself. Now, mind you, this is all these are happening like in the same hour within the same area. The plovers, the semi and the black-bellied, spent half of their time actually feeding, while they spent a little less time of their time interacting with each other. The semi-pollinated and the black-bellied interacted very well with each other. There's actually this tire that is in Caven Point that they would often hide in the shade of it, and I would say that they were playing with each other, because they would like often like interact with each other like that, and they spent a little less of their time, which was about like an average of 5 minutes actually cleaning themselves. So with my conclusions and finding, I found that my hypothesis was actually incorrect. The snowy egret and the plovers did not, like within the given time frame, avoid each other. They actually seemed to coexist very well, and within the time that I actually studied them in. They did not really avoid each other. There was no animosity between the birds. As I stated before, the black-bellied plover and the semi-pollinated plover actually interacted very well. I think they're friends. Um, so I believe that they had not much trouble interacting with each other. So yeah, that's the end. The next one is, I believe, Kashish and Gian. So
Hello, can you hear me?
yeah.
Okay. Okay. So for this birding project, me and Kashish, we worked together because we realized that combining our data was going to make the project more beneficial. So for this birding survey, what we decided to do was to go more in depth in how the amount of species has changed in Caven Point because of industrialization. And the way we decided to answer this scientific question was by taking two industrial locations and comparing the data before the industries were created versus the data that we were collecting throughout our time in Caven Point. And the two industrial locations that we chose was Port Liberté and the National Golf Club. And we decided to research more on the 6 different locations, the 6 different habitats, and exploring them. And so one thing we had to keep in mind throughout our research was that we were birding during fall migration, which meant that we weren't going to see that many bird species outside.
So the methods that we specifically used was we picked 6 locations, and then in the 6 locations, we spent 5-minute intervals in them. And we took out our phones and we also recorded the sounds we were hearing, because a lot of times, especially it was like with the tall grass and stuff, it was a bit hard to physically like see the birds. So we like wrote down their noises, and a lot of the birds, it's like they were moving pretty fast. So it was a little hard to take out our Pearson field guide and like physically like try to flip the pages and find them. So in our notebooks, we would like write down as the descriptions, the characteristics, how the birds looked, so that later we can ID them. And yeah, so we spent the 5 minutes each time, and we did it over a course of 3 weeks.
For this first chart you see here, as I said before, we chose 6 different habitats. And so the habitats we chose were sand/marshes, tall grass, short grass, the pond/bridge, trees, and the fishing dock. And we recorded all the birds that we saw in those different locations for the 3 trials that we were there, which was 3 different days. And that gave us a good image of the different species that were there and the ones that we saw most frequently. In this second chart here, it was more of like an overall chart, and basically we wrote down all the bird species that we saw into one chart, and we want to see the quantity and how much we saw. So as you can see on the side, red was for rarely seen, the green was if we saw a couple of them, and blue was if we saw an abundance of them.
And a reason that we specifically wanted to make this type of chart was because there was a survey conducted with Texas Instruments, like the company that makes like our TI-84 calculators, about like the birds in Caven Point in 1977. And this is exactly what they did. They kind of like split it in 3 categories, which is like birds that were rarely seen a couple of times, and then seen in abundance. So we kind of wanted to mimic that for our 2020 survey, just so it's like when we compare it to the Texas Instruments one, the data, this research methods, like they align as closely as possible. You can do the next slide. Yeah, okay. And then this is basically our master sheet of all the different species of birds we found, and not just in 2020, but also the ones that were recorded in 1977 and 2005. which we thought was really interesting to like kind of just put out all of the birds that were seen, and if they were seen in all of these 3 years, or if there were like species that left or species that came in. So as you can see, there are definitely an abundance of species in Caven Point. So it was really, really cool to like put them all together side by side and compare when they were present and when they weren't. Okay, so based on the data that we collected with the master sheet and everything, something we found interesting was that out of all of the species that we saw, the two species that were present in all 3 of the years, the 1977, 2005, and 2020, were the mourning dove and the killdeer. But besides that, from the birds we surveyed in the 6 weeks, there were not any other birds we found that were consecutively present in those 3 years. So we thought that was pretty interesting because that can lead to a future question of why is it specifically that these birds decided to stay in Caven Point all these years, and why there are so many birds like the snowy egret or like oyster catchers that were present in some years but weren't present in other years.
And one thing to add on and to like keep in mind is that even though the survey methods and like the resources that we used were different compared to the estuary logs and the Texas instruments that were provided to us, it did still give us like an overall image of the diversity of birds there was at Caven Point, and like it helped us make the comparisons that we had for our research.
That's it.
Excellent. Thank you all so very much. I apologize. I realized that we probably should have, split this up into 3, questions, like QA periods. So for all of the participants who are here, if you have any questions, please just reference which project you're referring to so the correct students can address them. And I agree with Keith. Great work. I am learning so much, as am I. Excellent work, everyone. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Erin. I'd love to know which species you were most surprised to see while you were birding. If there was anyone in particular that was of great interest to you. I know you said you guys saw a lot.
Is that directed at everybody or?
Yeah, sure, everyone.
Oh, I can go if you guys don't mind. I was most surprised to actually see the osprey, because I wasn't expecting to see like a bird of prey in Caven Point. Like it was like we actually first seen it flying above us, and it looked like very large, and I was just very confused as to like why it was here in Jersey City. It was very interesting, so I was most surprised to see that. So yeah.
A bird that I was actually kind of surprised to see was we found a hybrid bird of a mallard duck and an American black hybrid. So that was really interesting to see because I don't think, when you look at birds, you don't really think of like hybrids. So I was like, that's pretty cool to see that there can be bird hybrids as well.
One bird that surprised me and I was actually like fascinated about was the belted kingfisher, because like listening to the sound it made like this weird sound, and like it was like kind of hard to identify it, but I found that really surprising and
interesting. For me, the most surprising bird was honestly the great egret, because like the first time, that's the bird that caught my eye because one, it was the biggest and it was white, so compared to the marshy area that we were in, it stood out to me the most. And that was also my favorite bird because when it flies, it's really elegant. Like it flies really slow compared to the other birds that I saw at Caven Point.
Thanks.
Oops, I have a question for you. So some great birds and great work you did. I love seeing those history comparisons are just wonderful. But I wondered if I'm looking at it and I'm seeing some endangered, threatened, and species of concern. I wonder if you checked any of those birds against a state list of ones that are in trouble, because that would be a great addition to that study to really list those birds and how critical Caven Point is to those birds that are slowly disappearing and threatened.
That's actually, yeah, that's definitely a really good future study idea. We can definitely do that in the future. Because while we were researching, that definitely was a question like a lot of us thought about, how exactly like Caven Point has an effect on these species and the presence of them. So I feel like that's definitely something really interesting to look forward to in the future.
Yep. Great job.
And going back to your question, we actually saw an American kestrel, which is threatened.
Absolutely.
So that was really interesting because the first day that we were there, the park, like the rangers, they told us that Caven Point is really important because of all the history that it's honestly been through, because due to a lot of construction and honestly just people moving and like immigrating and stuff, a lot of birds and wildlife was lost. Like one of the rangers was telling us that now she sees seals and dolphins at Liberty State Park, which was really surprising to the group because we never thought that we could see that in Jersey City. So, and the golf course, we heard that they're trying to win over Caven Point. So I think that's really important because there are endangered birds, threatened birds, and like other animals there that are really concerning. So, oh, and we also saw a diamondback turtle, which I think is also endangered if I'm remembering correctly. So I think that's why Caven Point is a really important area that needs to be protected from further construction.
Absolutely. Great job.
Absolutely excellent job. Thank you all very much, and thank you for those questions. Before we move on, are there any other questions for these wonderful birders?
I just wanted to quickly say those hypotheses and conclusions, like we all learned so much, and it was fantastic to find out that there was historical data that Liberty State Park Rangers provided for us, so thank you. One thing we would like to do, hopefully if our schedules allow, is do a bird walk for whether it be Bergen County Audubon folks or people involved with Greener JC. We'll of course have to ask permission from the park, but yeah, so please look out for some communication on that.
I'm in. That
yes, me too.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you all again very much. Rosalie, if you'd like, you can